Hello everyone, I'm Professor Paul Carrier of the Western Michigan University Thomas M. Cooley Law School. I would like to talk about the material that is assigned for Class 6 of our Contracts 1 class. A few things first, you will be taking a midterm at the beginning of Class 6. The multiple choice can cover everything up to today's material, might not. The short answer essay will not be testing anything on consideration. We simply have not gone far enough for me to feel comfortable in testing on that material. Okay, so at least on the second portion of the midterm, you don't have to worry about last week's and this week's material on consideration. Speaking of last week, before we get into today's material, we entered the third, but our final category of coverage for the four main components of contract formation, and that was consideration or the quid pro quo. Remember, it's not a contract if both sides don't really want something from the other. I want your motorcycle, here's $10,000. I want that tennis ball, here's $1. I want that tennis ball, here's $1 zillion. Something's wrong with that last one. You can see that, right? So that would not be consideration. It's not bargained for. It's a gift. It's a bribe. It's anything but a contract. And remember, there are good reasons for people to try, perhaps unethically, to treat things as contracts when they are not. For example, estate taxes might be greater than people would like to pay, and if they can establish what looks like a contractual relationship, it looks like a business deal that is not taxed, as opposed to a gift or an estate transfer that might be taxed at a relatively high rate. So there are reasons why people try to do this. Okay, and it's not just out of the goodness of their hearts. Often it's tax evasion. And that's one of the reasons why we look in every case for consideration. Also, don't forget, with regard to option contracts, there would be two transactions. There's the underlying transaction, which could be $10,000 on my end, a motorcycle on your end. Okay? If you need a week to think about the deal, and you do not want me to deal with anyone else, you may try for an option. Please give me 1 week to say yes or no. That 1 week of time frame that someone's asking for so that their power of acceptance is not terminated is its own separate contract. It's its own separate agreement. And so the common law rule has always been that there must be separate consideration for that one as well. Often it was minimal, $1, a beer. Okay? Now, today with UCC Article 2, 2-205 firm offers, if it's in writing, you don't need separate consideration for it because you've got the proof in the writing. As well, at common law, if you look at Restatement 2nd, Section 87, Sub 1, if somebody mentions an option contract to leave open that time to accept, and there's a writing that states that consideration has been paid for that open time frame, that locked-in time frame, then the writing is also sufficient. And so on that particular level, the Article 2 of the UCC and its states adoption is the same, of course, and the common law track virtually identically, so to speak. So you see the importance of it. Understand that courts tend to look only at the legal sufficiency. Is this a thing that somebody might want? Is that a thing that somebody might want? And if those match, usually the courts stop. $5 for a tennis ball, $3 for a Coca-Cola, $1 for 2 quarters to use the coin machine when the person with $1 does not have change. Those are all fine. Okay? Forbearance. I won't sue you if you give me $1,000 now, but I think I can, and I think that I can win, but I won't. I'll give up drinking, smoking, and gambling for $2,000. I can, and I might like it, but I will give it up if you give me $2,000 after I finish 2 years without doing that. All of those things are legally sufficient. And typically, courts look, and if it doesn't see a significant disparity in value or any real problem like tax evasion, for example, then courts will tend to stop right there. If, however, things look a little bit fishy, courts can go a little bit further and ask into adequacy. Is a $1 million mansion something that this person would honestly give for a tennis ball? Something is wrong here. So courts can go into the question of adequacy when courts see a problem, and often a huge disparity in value is indicative of some kind of problem where you better, dare I say it, stop, drop, and roll. Go into the adequacy question. You must ask adequacy if it looks fishy. It might still be okay. He really needed that Pepsi. He just got out of the desert. The next closest liquid is 10 miles away. So he might want to pay $10,000 for that Pepsi. It looks inadequate, but he has a real reason why he needs that Pepsi now. By the way, I should have Pepsi pay me some money for this. Good product, mind you. But so is Coca-Cola, so is RC Cola. I'm not trying to shut any doors there. Whoever pays me most wins. No, I'm not being paid. Okay, so we covered what consideration is, the sufficiency, and then the adequacy question if necessary. So you should have a pretty good sense of that, what works, what doesn't. And this week after the midterm exam, we are still in the concept or the area of consideration, and we're covering things now that, first of all, if you have a huge inadequacy, a disparity, maybe you say it's not consideration. $1 million mansion for a tennis ball fails. Okay, let's be honest. Other categories that often are not appropriate consideration. Last week, we did learn that love and affection is something you kind of owe, and so for you to bargain for it doesn't work. Historically, it doesn't work. I'll give you $1,000 if you think I'm the best professor ever. Well, that one actually might work because you don't have a legal duty to like me. But what if it's your dad, your grandfather? Your estranged grandfather comes in and says, if you like me for the next 5 years before I die, I'll give you $10,000 in my will. You're supposed to like him or not without having been paid. And public policy does not like payment for something like that. Okay? So, to be smart, if that's you, change something. Grandfather, my favorite grandfather, I will visit you every week except for a few when I'm on vacation as consideration for the $10,000. I will love and cherish you, and I'll see you every week, almost every week, every year long. That extra bit is proper consideration. You're forbearing the going off and going to the bar. You're forbearing going off into the bowling alley. You're going to see Grandpa. That is extra. You probably just provided appropriate consideration where love and affection might not have been enough. Okay? Another one, the illusory consideration. That's where somebody doesn't really promise something. It sounds like they might be, but they're not. For example, I will sell you my house for $300,000 if I still want to next week. Did you see that if I still want to bit? I'm maintaining the right to take it away at any time and not really get locked in. Okay? And if I'm not legally bound to it because I maintain that discretionary ability to say no, if I change my mind at a whim, you lose. That is not a legally binding position, and therefore it is not legally sufficient. Okay? So there's a difference between a conditional consideration, where, for example, if I get paid next week, then I'll buy your bike. We can gauge whether or not I get paid next week. And if I do, and I fail to buy your bike, you can sue me, right? But the case I gave you was where I could maintain the option to go forward or not go forward at my entire option with no external controls. That being the case, I have not bound myself. That would be an illusory promise, and that does not constitute consideration. Okay? And you see that in the Lucy Lady Duff Gordon case. You see that in Sylvan Crest, Grant, and Sand and Gravel as well. And you see it in the McMichael versus Price case. But what I would say is keep in mind that illusory promises are not proper consideration. However, there are certain categories where the courts can imply something like good faith. I'll buy all the sand I need from you next year. How much is that? That's not a quantity, is it? But could somebody look at me and say, if you acted in good faith, you would have bought 100,000 cubic yards, right? Between 80 and 120. That might be normal for my business. So if I buy 0 or I buy 50, someone could come to say you were not acting reasonably, and yet you had a duty to act in good faith and reasonably to buy as much sand roughly as you needed. So we can target that amount to be something like 100,000 cubic yards, whatever I said. And so we can gauge it that way. In other words, we have a quantity term that's a little bit open, and someone can say, well, we didn't pick quantity, so it's illusory. I don't have to do that because it's not really a promise. And courts can come back and say, wait a second. We can determine how much you should have purchased had you been acting normally. We can gauge that. And that's the standard we can use. Therefore, since we can find a standard that we can rely on based on facts and circumstances, you can be bound by that. And if you can be bound by that, it's appropriate consideration. And I'll talk about in class requirement and outputs contracts, which are pretty important ideas that come from UCC 2-309. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Well, certainly in the class period. No, forgive me. I made a mistake there. Let me change that. It's UCC 2-306 for output and requirements contracts. And you see in Lady Duff Gordon, didn't the person, Mr. Wood, I think it was, did he promise he was going to sell at least $100,000 worth of clothing with her name on it and give her half the profits? It was not that well defined, okay? But could we say that he promised to act reasonably and sell as much as he can, acting reasonably and in good faith? And that would be anywhere from $70,000 to $100,000 worth. We could probably gauge that. We can imply that. And if we can imply that on his obligation for what he gives to her, that implied amount can be treated as legally sufficient consideration. If he's not bound to do anything, it's illusory. If he's bound to act in good faith and we can come up with a number, then he's bound to that, and that is in fact consideration. And that's what happened in the Lucy Lady Duff Gordon case. There are one or two more with regard to basically quantity or amounts of work done that are a little bit undefined, and yet the courts can find a way, acting reasonably or acting in good faith, to come up with a number, and that makes those less than clear quantity terms, right, makes them something that we can call legally sufficient because we can determine how much they should have done, the parties who are obligated to act that way, had they been acting in good faith, had they been acting reasonably. Okay, so keep in mind illusory is not, but courts often can find ways of taking something that looks illusory but add some kind of duty to act reasonably, duty to act in good faith, and with that they can come up with a number in court based on the facts and circumstances, and it becomes then legally sufficient and therefore binding. We will cover consideration for 2 more weeks. In week 7, for class 7, we cover a few more things that may not be consideration. Okay? For example, a pre-existing duty. That might not be consideration if you ask for more money, but you're already obligated to work for $1,000 a week. Then I agreed to pay you more money, but what did you do extra for that? If the answer to that is nothing, I only have to pay you $1,000 a week and not the extra. Okay? Past consideration. If you did something for me last year, and then you talk to me and I say, you know what, you did a nice thing, I should give you $1,000 for that. Well, what did you do now for that $1,000? And the answer is nothing. So you can't sue me for that. All right? That's past consideration, and I can't bargain for that. It's already done. So what do you do in that case? Playing a smart game. You realize your consideration was past. You realize I'm making what looks like a gratuitous promise, and you add something else. Oh, that's great, Professor. You give me $1,000, and I'll make you a pie once a year for the next 10 years. Perfect. That pie actually acts as the consideration that we need from your side, so it's not past, but it's present future, and it matches my promise to give you $1,000. Okay? Then we get to week 8, class 8. We're going to talk about some consideration substitutes. There may be cases where there is not truly consideration, but it would be evil for the court not to find a binding agreement. And to foreshadow just a little bit, often the example is a unilateral contract. What if I say to you, if you paint my garage and it's a big job, I'll give you $5,000. And you begin to paint, right? Now, in fact, you do something else. Like you go out and pay money to hire a bunch of painters. You're out that money, but I might still walk away from you. Well, that's not fair. So the law can imply consideration as a substitute. I made you go out, spend money, and get a new work crew. And because I did that, I should be bound to my bargain and not be able to back out. Okay, folks, I'll see you then in class 6.